Allison from Igloo Letterpress in Worthington, and I get excited about printing because I grew up as an assistant for my grandfather who had a printing press in his basement. So when I would write a poem at school, or if he was working on a project, he would let me help with the typesetting, and we would go to the type case and choose letter by letter to spell out whatever I had written or whatever he wanted to say. And we would print multiple copies that I could either give away to my friends or he could give away at a historical fair for a demonstration. When I got to college, I realized how special that was and how much I missed the printing and the process of printing. And I started taking art classes. So even though I was a history major, I spent maybe more time in the art department, learning how to mix ink, learning how to set type faster, and learning how to do poetry books and posters. In my senior year, I decided that instead of going on a study abroad program, I would go to the Smithsonian, and they had a history of graphic arts in the American History Museum. And I got to do demonstrations of 18th and 19th century printing in the museum while the museum was open. So if your family had been on vacation at the museum that time, I would have tried to get you excited about printing and show you how the printing presses worked. I may have a great idea and I may think it's brilliant, but it's not enough for me to have an idea. As a human being, I want to tell somebody else about it. And I like thinking about the development of language and an oral tradition of sharing stories, and how eventually that wasn't enough either. People wanted a written language, developing alphabets all over the world in language so that they could share what they were thinking about. And the fact that it got to a point where that wasn't enough. Now we need to be able to make multiple copies. We need to be able to share that information with more and more people, and more people need to learn how to read. So there's a whole history of people developing language, developing different alphabets, and that is all leading up to this, way of sharing what we care about. And that's the point for me that I get excited about making multiples, and why the invention of the printing press is important to me. When Gutenberg was alive, the books were rare, they were expensive to produce, and the thing that his contribution that I think is most significant is that he had the knowledge of how to work with metals because he was a jewelry maker. So he knew how he could create an alloy of different metals that would be strong enough to hold up to the pressure of the press and allow the ink to be transferred to the paper. But then what was so great is you could reuse it. So you could keep all of your A's and all of your T's and put them back into a case, and then you could use them again the next time you wanted to print a project. It wasn't a single use. It could be used over and over again. So the process of letterpress printing is relief printmaking. So this is the surface, the top, L-O-V-E. It's backwards because when we place the ink on it and it gets pressed onto the paper, it will be correct on the paper. It needs to be a mirror image of what's going to be printed. This was a solid block of linoleum, and it was carved away, so only the top face, the surface of the letters, was left. And whether this is a wood material or metal material, it's all that same idea. It's a relief printmaking process, kind of like a rubber stamp where you're just putting ink on the surface and then kissing it to the paper.
I wonder if this is where Da Vinci got his idea of writing his designs backwards, and
I don't know.
Was able to, because to me that's kind of like the first version of protecting yourself against copyright laws. Is his way of, his way of doing that was trying to make it backwards so people wouldn't understand it.
I haven't thought about that in a long time. I don't know. This A comes from a larger piece that was hand typeset using different fonts that we have in our studio, and was printed as a poster. So if I wanted to print this poster again, my lockup is still here. I need to go back and add a few more spacing things that have been borrowed for other projects. But this is a way to speed up the process. So if I own a newspaper and I've been lucky enough to sell advertising in my newspaper, I would either create a block like this where it's ready to go every time that I print my newspaper, or I would have my hand set piece and I would keep it locked out so that I could use it in the next edition of the paper.
So then would you take this entire piece and like stamp it onto a piece of paper, and that's how you would make multiple copies of the same page?
That's right. So ink gets applied every time, and the paper is pressed down onto it, and the ink transfers to the paper. So over the years, there were many evolutions, many different patents that were developed to make the printing press easier to use. But really, Gutenberg's contribution of metal type, handset type, stayed the same. The alloy may have changed, the metals may have changed that were mixed together, and the height of the letters from the bottom to the top, but they were minute changes compared to the changes on the printing press.
So this is what would be used for like an entire page of a newspaper or something of that nature. And then just zooming in, it's hard for us to read because clearly it's written backwards and backwards. That way, when they go to press it, it would show up right on the paper.
This case comes from a cabinet of type that we have here at Igloo that we could use over and over again to print whatever we want. So this is very, very small type. This is the map that shows me where all the letters are. And just like when you're sitting at a keyboard, you memorize where the letters are and your fingers know where to go. When I'm in good practice, I remember how to do this. So capital A. This is a very, very small font, and this A is upside down, so let me flip it over. Some letters are lucky. This is a symmetrical letter. It's going to be right down it's going to look the same forwards as it looks backwards, but when I turn it upside down, I can see that this piece of type has notches that are carved onto it, and that was part of the mold. So the foundry that made this type did that, so that when I lay it into my composing stick, I'm going to know that I'm putting the letters in upside down, but they're all going to line up. So you can see the notches here starting to line up. So I've got the knee of my composing stick, and I'm going to use my thumb to control the type as I build it out in the composing stick. So it's going to be a mirror image of what I want my page to look like.
So when she was talking about the end of this and I was trying to zoom in on it, you can kind of see a little bit there that the letter is on the face, whereas when I was trying to zoom in a minute ago, it was a little blurry. So we're going to look at a bigger one here. So when
I believe that's 24 point. And that's a capital B.
So you've got the B here, and then it's on the side. So this is the same design here. It's just when I turn this one up for you, the camera doesn't zoom in. It does a little bit. You can kind of see the outline of the T, whereas since this one's bigger, it's easier for you to see that structure.
So if you have a favorite font and you like to lay things out on the computer, some of these names are going to be familiar. This is Century Schoolbook, and that's 48-point Century Schoolbook. So this is one of the larger metal typefaces that we have. This is 24-point Standard Gothic, which is a sans serif typefaces. It doesn't have the curves that come down here, like on the top of the T. And then the tiny, tiny one is 6-point Garamond. So if you come to Igloo and you want to work on a project, I won't let you use anything smaller than 12 the first time, because it's just too hard. I want you to have a good experience and come back. The Gutenberg Bible. There were other texts that could have been produced, right? But Gutenberg wanted to sell the book. So he chose to make the Bible because he knew there was already an audience of people who would buy Bibles. So he carved a font that looked like what the scribe's handwriting looked like. He wasn't trying to make something that looked completely different. He wanted to make something that looked like what people were used to seeing at their church. So he made his best copy of that black letter, that calligraphy that the monks and scribes did. So the metal type was designed to look like that, and he used the same materials to make the book that the monks would have used. So the animal hide was used because that's what the scribes used for their hand calligraphed books.
Did he make that? Did he write that in Latin? Do you know, or German?
Latin, I think.
Yeah, I
I
think.
have some reproduction pages, but I think it's Latin.
I would imagine that it was originally Latin, and
Yeah.
then he does his whole German going against the church thing a little bit later.
You know, that
So
would
it might be
a
other
great thing to look
copies.
up. I shouldn't say, I'm not sure. Yeah. The animal skin, the parchment, and the vellum, it lasts a long time, right? So we now have papers that are very acidic, and they're not meant to last a long time. But this was a book that was going to be chained in a library. The monks were going to use something that could last for centuries. And Gutenberg was trying to copy as best he could what they did so people would see there was a market to make multiples that they could sell.
So in that way, it was almost like a business decision to
That's how I think about it.
get his investor for his investor to see the benefit and the payback for investing and helping him pay for the press.
And I think I think there's a cultural shift now than in Gutenberg's time, where we're used to things changing and we want to see what's next and what's new. But at that time in Germany, they wanted to see something that was safe and that was going to be a good investment that could be sold.
This quote is by Beatrice Ward, who was one of the very first and only female type designers in the 1900s. And she wrote this quote, and it hangs in many print studios all over the world. And I really wanted to typeset it as part of a gallery that I did for my letterpress prints about a year ago. And so I typeset it out of 4 different fonts. I had to restart it a couple times because I kept running out of sorts or letters. And I had to prove it a couple different times because there's a couple of fonts in there that have very similar ones in the same tray. And so I kept putting the wrong letters in there. But once you proof it, you can see that pretty easily. It took me about 6 to 7 hours over a 2-night period, and this is the final print. It's 3 runs. There's the light blue kind of shadow behind it, and then there's kind of the darker turquoise on top, and then down at the very, very bottom, Beatrice's name is in a blind impression, which is when we do a impression with no ink